All right. Thanks, everybody, for reconvening this morning. It's good to see everybody again, everybody that's still around here. We're going to kick today off by looking at, kind of where we left off yesterday with high-level takeaways from the various breakout sessions, and let's try to keep it as concise as possible. So high-level topics from your slide decks, and then we're going to look at the Slido topics. And the last time I looked, I think we could pretty much cover all of the topics on Slido, and we'll see where we're at with that. And then we'll go out to breakout groups for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we'll come back here and wrap up and try to be done by 11 or so. All right. 680B, are you ready to go? I need to shuffle the slide deck so that, And then please go to the general notes document. I don't have that link up, but it's available from the agenda and the workshop website. You can find the agenda on that, and then there's a link to the general notes document. Add to that. I started to put some high-level kind of takeaways that I've been getting out of this that I thought about on my drive here. So feel free to add to that or comment.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Is this working? Yeah. So from our group, we were talking about high-level curation and processing, and when should data just be handed over to the community. So sometimes you don't want to over-process data. You want to be able to just hand over the raw data because there's too much effort in processing. Um, we don't know how future scientists will use the data. And is loosey compression a risk? Because sometimes scientists in the future may want to use the data, but if you might lose some of that data. So how much of the data you need to preserve was the discussion there. Findability and searchability of data sets is difficult. Can large language models be used for better searching and better findability or discoverability, I guess? Can they also help unify metadata standards? What kind of metadata is actually needed to drive workflows? Is there too high a burden on data producers to adhere to all standards? Are too many domain specific are there too many domain specific metadata standards? We were talking, there's like a gazillion of them. Is there a technical solution to supporting robust metadata? Some some way of empowering scientists without the burden of intimately knowing standards. Software may be able to solve these challenges. So there's so many of these, metadata standards. It's hard for people who are just coming in, especially, to be able to understand, or be able to like on ramp into the situation. Um, Sustainable funding models, different levels of service depending on data users. This is kind of a interesting topic, and consider equity issues if moving to some sort of premium model. We were talking about U.S. versus European or ECMWF sort of models and such. How to measure impact of data. Our incentive structures may be too quantitative. Is it really all about the numbers?
Thank you. Damon, breakout room. Did anybody local experience hail last night? Raise of hands. Yep. That was good lightning. It was a really good show last night. As long as you didn't get golf balls.
Cutting into my time.
Sorry. It's early. A little rambly this morning. Okay.
No worries. So let's see. We first got into the there's common elements for data producer needs, and we probably need to do a better job of teasing these out. Everybody needs storage, backups, and so on, but there's probably more things here that are common requirements for data producers. And then, of course, there's domain-specific aspects as well. So there's perhaps an opportunity for diving more into and thinking more about common foundations upon which bespoke solutions can be built. We really kind of like the GitHub model that provides a common platform that different communities can rally around and build services upon. The topic of trusted repositories came up. It's not enough just to put something out there. There needs to be assurances for the data producers that it will persist, it will survive, it'll be maintained. Constant curation is needed. It's not just storage. And then lastly, and I think maybe the thing that maybe the most interest and maybe even controversy around was the strong desire for an agency or NSF-supported centralized data curation service. Data providers should be able to focus their efforts on data collection and not all the tedious tasks that go along with data curation. We noted that data management plans that are elements of agency proposals are not enough. They're not enforced. So perhaps more oversight in the proposal review process is required to ensure that data management plans are realistic and that they're connected with data storage services. And then support for data management and preservation needs really need to begin at the proposal stage. We heard a fair bit from Angel about the Copernicus data store and really kind of were intrigued by that model that seems to be working well in the EU. And it's probably something that we should look more deeply into. So.
All right, thanks, John. Chapman. So we kind of broke this out into challenges and solutions. So for challenges, there's differing expectations between sponsors. There's also differing expectations for publishers. Some sponsors provide data repository support, in the background. If you get an award from DOE or someplace, then you get to put your data in the DOE repository. For NSF, that's not necessarily the case. For all NSF programs, some programs have it, some programs don't. Gaps in the repository ecosystem. How do you evaluate if a data set will be impactful to the community? That's one question that comes up for some of these sponsors if they're going to support a data set. Is there a sunsetting strategy for selected data types? I think that came up here a few times in the main session. What data needs to be preserved and shared to meet open science expectation? And, this is a theme I've heard already. What metadata provides value for some of these modernized workflows? Does all the metadata that we collect historically, do we need to collect all that? Do we need to continue to do that? Is that just an addition of, every PI wants their little piece, like every PI wants every parameter out of the model? And then for solutions, for machine learning software, it'd be great if it just has the capability to ingest some of these, earth science data formats, include considerations for data preservation, reuse, as resource considerations as part of a project, however that is, just needs to be considered. I think what you talked about with data management plan, raise the importance of that, look at the past record of success on data management plans, and then how does impact change as a function of time? So the term data pruning and weeding came up in terms of, how do we keep everything forever? Is it worth the investment, or can we deassess some things? So that was Chapman. Main seminar room.
So some of the challenges that we discussed in the main seminar room regarding publicly sharing data sets were the need to specify data and metadata standards for uncommon data sets. We also talked about there being a limited software stack for processing uncommon data sets, and that we may have different timelines for serving different versions of the data. We also discussed a need to identify and specify funding for each stage of the data cycle, and not just like producing the data, and that there's a challenge with balancing quality control and immediate data availability in terms of if we want to get data sets made publicly available quickly, it's hard to have a thorough quality control. We also talked a decent amount about software governance, and that was equally as important as data governance. when funding is unavailable, there was some discussion about kind of crowdsourcing within a domain to create more reliable software, and that there also may be limited documentation on software, and that if we could automate some of this, that may be helpful. And then we lastly, in regards to software, talked about porting existing software to modern hardware architecture. That was also a challenge that we see coming up. Data governance for data uploaded to the commons was another topic that we discussed. And within that, we talked about quality control and how we may deal with unintentional mistakes or bad actors. And I think the main point that came out of that was to trust people, but also do verification. And that sometimes needs to be done like within the domain that we're working with. Sovereignty and privacy concerns were another factor that came up for social data in particular. And then we also wanted to increase trustworthiness for citizen data specifically. And to do that, we were thinking that one solution may be by having workflows, community forums, and FAQs that can kind of verify that data.
Great. That's a lot of good ideas. Okay, library A.
All right, so we started by just going around the table and having people talk about what types of data they may produce. There were a number of folks in the room who were in that bucket, both on the facility and the individual PI side. And we got all that in the notes. It's not listed on this slide, but it was pretty striking, the diversity of types of data and types of science questions and projects people talked about, not just within our small group. And so I think the takeaway for me there was, whatever the data commons means, the common denominator, as was discussed yesterday by the speaker in the morning, could be a lot of thought required to kind of get to that. We talked about incentives for data sharing, roles of data embargo, so concerns for people for releasing data that somebody else might, analyze those data before you do and kind of scoop your potential findings. It's still a concern, even though it's been around for a long time. But that's still there, and we need to be aware of that, potentially take steps to either get around it or accommodate it. Let's see. So then we did a fairly deep dive into repositories and kind of the challenge of, as a producer, especially as a PI, where should data go? So talked about different types of standardization and maturity for repositories, tractable goals for the data commons, but also enabling less advanced communities to be involved in many ways. And general challenges of where should data be archived, I think, are still out there. What capabilities do archives provide? How do we avoid silos? We talked about Zenodo as a case study, which is a general repository that anyone can contribute anything to, but it's also uncurated. So we did have a good discussion about the sort of pros and cons of that approach and how that might be, there are things to consider both on the pros and cons of a service like that. So I think John, you mentioned earlier that sort of storage versus curation and some of the trade-offs to doing both of those in easy fashion. So I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Matt. Library B.
Thank you.
So when you hit slideshow, does it update it?
Yeah, it doesn't update it. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much. We had a great discussion yesterday. One of the key points of our yesterday discussion was how we can build equal and transparent partnership with private sector. So how we can define clear intentions in writings or some sort of agreements prior to the work, and can nonprofit sector benefit from partnership with commercial sector in terms of it would be more free tier services for commercial or academia and nonprofit sector, and then private sector will pay for the costs. And then there was a discussion about someone said in our breakout session yesterday that there used to be agreements that prevented profit making from some of the research data before early 2000. And another thing we talked about is the importance of discussions between different agencies on the sort of agreements that they can get and the sort of partnerships that they are receiving from the commercial cloud services or the private sector. And another important thing we talked about was about policies regarding publicly sharing data set. If a new researcher or if a new faculty member want to publicly share their data, there are some ambiguity what resources they can use, and also there are some policies that in different organizations that might prevent them from sharing that easily. And then one other thing we talked about was there aren't any clear insight on how much things actually cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So both we talk about cloud and we talk about HPC or on-premises resources. All are technically there are some costs associated with all of them. So what are the costs of each one of and how we can have more transparency regarding these costs. Another thing we talked about was a shift in mindset from data management to data engineering that will benefit and accelerate research. We also talked about the federation concept in European agencies and how it helped define their distributed cloud with resources close to the end requirements. And finally, we talked about having data standards and best practices that is determined by the community and the importance of also partnering up with different communities adjacent to us. For example, astrophysics is like one great example, and benefit from their experience on data standards and best practices.
Okay, thanks, Megan. C.
Right, we're back to the last. So, one thing that a lot of people talked about in our group is the how can we provide tools, common tools and services to automate some of the process for curation and management of the data. For example, there's current development about like common toolings about data quality controls and other things that can make data repositories and data managers' life much easier. And also this discussion about different level of like data services and products. And so what's the trade-off, sweet spots between providing the raw data plus the workflow to help other people to recreate the data, or the level of user-friendly data that we want to provide, that there's always constraints between resources and then the availability of those services. And also one thing is the trustworthiness and the sustainability of those data services and from data producers and repositories, and really is how the concept community come back again. Like, do we have one community or have multiple communities within it and trying to have this bottom-up approach to define the best practice or common practice that have been discussed by many groups before.
Right, we'll give you all a round of applause. If you can pop the Slido up real quick. Let's see where we're at with that. All right, let's see now. Can you start at the top? So education and outreach, what collaborations can we initiate? Expanding accessibility and standardization. Okay. Gap analysis. Mechanism for dataset versioning, which enables end users to receive push notifications when a dataset is updated. Okay, do people want to vote on these? And we'll kind of see what rises to the top. Well, I'm going to call it at 9:27 on that clock in the back, which is at 9:24 right now. So what we're going to go with are the top 7, because we have 7 breakouts. If everybody's okay with that. and I'm merging a couple of them, but so education and outreach, what approaches work for different communities? Accessibility and standardization of processes. Collaborations, what collaborations can we initiate at this work meeting? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Policies, and then I think the next two, policies and data ascension and deaccession, kind of go together. So that's what, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would be gap analysis. 6 would be what's your version of a data commons look like. 7, is there a timeline? There is kind of a timeline that we have to follow, so I don't know if it's a good breakout topic or not, but we can include that. So we have to write a report within 3 months, so that's kind of the first timeline metric we have to hit. I'll kind of talk about that at the end. What are the barriers to cloud? So community building, I'm going to kind of lump that one in with the top one with education, outreach, communities. Is that okay? And then another one, kind of community here, so I think that could go in there. What are the barriers to adopting cloud computing? Are people interested in that one? Okay. All right, so I think I kind of had this more or less. Good.
Maybe can we expand that topic, because there's
Yep.
some discussion about cloud and then the running it. not
Okay.
just the cloud kind of.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave this like what it is, but we'll I'm going to put gap analysis up here. Okay.
Doug, are you editing something we should be able to see?
Yep. So I'm going to put it back up here. I learned this from Megan 1 minute ago, and then can we put the breakout group assignments? Yeah, that's a lot, but main seminar room. So this is, we voted via Slido, and now I'll have the chance to vote by our feet and where we go as well. So we're not assigned to breakout rooms at this point. Sorry, moderators and note takers, breakout rooms, but so main seminar. Education and outreach and community building, and we can reflect back on what the Slido said exactly in terms of this topic, but there are a number of topics that were kind of aligned with community building and components of education and outreach. So I think that it's up to you today to kind of explore these topics how you'd like. Damon, what collaborations can we initiate at this meeting to work on a concrete next steps identified by the workshop? Oh, and I did put including timeline in that one, I guess. So there can be some timeline discussion there. Libraries, A, would be policies. In general, how do we modernize our policies? There's a number of different topics that we can look at there. B, expanding accessibility and standardization of processes within the framework of limited funding. C would be what are the barriers to adopting cloud computing, and the topic of HPC and role of HPC and cloud can come into that one. So that's your topic. So good, that's good. Where does equity and discoverability and fit for purpose fit in? That's in Chapman, so that's Jackie and Joseph. And then 680B is what is your vision for a data commons look like now? And kind of we can include a gap analysis of what exists and what doesn't exist to support that vision. Does that sound okay to everybody? Go ahead, Egg Belly.
What about people who are virtual, if they want to go into a different room, can we?
We don't have virtual breakouts, so.
Okay. I guess 680, we can turn on the little Google thing.
Yeah, it's just hard to get them what the link is and all that stuff.
Yeah,
So.
I guess that's a good point.
So we had one virtual yesterday because they were gonna attend and then their flight got canceled, but in general, that's how it is. So go ahead and choose your own adventure. we would like to reconvene here around 10:20, I would say. So it's going to be a little tighter than it has been. Go ahead and go through your notes, update the slides as we have been.
We don't want to go strong. That's a good one. It's kind of like what you see as the future.
All right, so we'll go ahead and start the process to wrap things up here. I'm gonna, hopefully most people have their slides filled out. All right, so we'll go ahead and do our breakout reports in a concise manner, and then we'll, kind of reflect on where we've been, what are next steps, how can we collaborate as a community, and then we'll close out the workshop. So if Chapman would like to go first, I'm going to see if we can navigate starting in the middle.
Okay, so we started with where does equability and discovery and fit for need purpose fit in, and we sort of wandered into the education and outreach topic afterwards. And so we started with understanding what providers can do better, knowing where the community wants to go. We're trying to, how can we build ties between providers and users, broadening the definition of user from the power users here at NCAR, scientists, and going down to different communities. We talked about FAIR, about the F, findable for who. Is it possible to sort of broaden the definition of FAIR beyond just data, metadata, to also providing tools and code, make that a part of FAIR? Studies show scientists may not be connected to who the data actually affects. We had Marion from the glaciology community, which is highly important to people in coastal communities that will be affected by sea level rise, but there's not much communication between the glaciology community and those people that are affected by sea level rise. More financial support for educators, leaders, power users, scientists to be trained, to train others, to just do events that help either train scientists in pedagogy so that they learn how to teach. I'm sure all of us have had a professor that we can remember that stood up in front of the class and was just horrible at teaching, just mumbled under their breath and wrote something down, and you're relying on the textbook and your peers to help get through that class. There are events like Tasha with CryoCloud. I'm one of the steering committee members of Ocean Hack Week. There are all sorts of events that are trying to broaden this sort of engagement, but largely we only reach out to people in academia, to grad students, undergraduates. How do we break out from the academic setting into the public? Can we give the people that come in through our classes the Jupyter notebooks and also the tools they need so that they can talk to their parents, their cousins, be able to do this sort of outreach that we need? Do we have a clear understanding of the definition of equity? You can talk to a bunch of people, ask them what the difference is between equity and equality, and they'll all argue with each other and say, you have your definition wrong. And so how do you do that? Recognizing that there may be different definitions from data providers, data users, curators, communities. Different people have different definitions, trying to help people get on the same page. We can invest in tools that can help break down the equity barrier. Jupyter notebooks, hackathons, no code, other sorts of events, workshops that should be tailored to the specific user community levels and needs. We shouldn't be asking people to come up the hill to Mesa Lab to have an event, even though Mesa Lab is a very beautiful place and everyone should see the view from up here, but we should be going into their communities, onto reservations, into areas impacted by climate change, about how to help build trust. From Dr. A's slides at the beginning where she showed, the EPA reports are saying the air is fine here, the water is fine here, and their sensors are saying, no, it's not. As individual scientists, we should be trying to reach out to them, help build our workflows, be able to push their data through our workflows and show that, yes, they are validated with what they're doing. And because I got roped into this, Hack the Hackathon, I am the chair of the organizing committee for Hack the Hackathon this year. We're holding it in San Diego, hopefully with support from NASA. It's a community of people that are trying to rethink hackathons, unconferences, workshops, hack weeks, just sort of educational and entrepreneurial events, figure out what works, what doesn't work. If you'd like to put pressure on NASA so that they'll fund us and that we know, I'd love to hear that so I can tell people, but once I get the confirmation or not, we'll probably open up registration in a month or two. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joseph. Damon Room breakout session.
Thanks, Doug. So let's see, we had a pretty small group and we were addressing the question, what collaborations can we initiate at this meeting and work on concrete next steps. I'm not sure I did, I'm not sure how well I've synthesized the ideas that came out of this, so I'm gonna go through the bullets here, but then I'm gonna give an opportunity for the participants in the session to clarify, augment, correct anything that I've stated here. We noted that there's potential for some transatlantic collaboration opportunities. We should be looking at what the European Commission is doing. There's a workshop that's right around the corner, July 1st and 2nd in Europe and Estonia. It's an opportunity where technology meets policymakers and cover things such as data clouds and data spaces, how to serve their stakeholders. So there's a link to that event in the notes here. How do we keep the momentum going from this workshop? We've had a lot of great discussion, hopefully spawned some collaborations, a lot of useful information exchanged. How do we build upon this? Maybe an annual meeting, establish communication channels and build upon the people that are already here. How do we engage with other data common efforts, both those that are represented here and those that may not be here? And I guess lastly, thinking about engagement with universities. And then finally, we talked about some open geospatial consortium activities. Just a note that there's a standardization working group that's looking at analysis-ready data, and also some activity around open science persistence demonstrations. And this is a collaboration with the OGC, NASA, ESA, and others. So I think that's it. Again, anybody from the breakout session, John, Niels, Mia, want to add to this? Okay.
All right, thanks, John. 680B, egg belly.
Okay, so the question was, what does your vision for data commons look like and the gap analysis? So we talked about we can't build data commons to rule them all, and it's desirable to be a community focused. But there is a clear need to reduce confusion. Where to store data, methods of access, and level of curation is needed. Data commons can act as a way to standardize community needs, i.e. common APIs. So you have a bunch of different data commons, but how can they all, I guess, talk together, or how can you come through someplace and access them all in an easy way? Commons should be able to handle both low and high level curation. Producers should clearly understand the requirements. Common search interface, natural language processing would be great. All types of data should work in the commons. Reduce barriers to store when possible. Commons should have capability to help with curation, assisted by data producers, i.e. automated methods of describing data. Ability to spin up domain-specific gateways. Reproducible workflows should exist adjacent to the data. Leveraging university connections and other domains to learn how they deal with similar problems.
All right, thank you. I think that's, yep. So Chapman is what?
All right, so in the main seminar room, we were discussing education and outreach and community building. Some existing successful approaches that we discussed were included both synchronous training and reproducible asynchronous workflows. So as far as synchronous training goes, we were talking about summer schools and workshops such as the ARM School and MetPy Mondays as all resources that involve synchronous training that have been really successful. We also talked about Pythia cookbooks, Pangeo Gallery, Unidata training, et cetera, as potential like reproducible asynchronous workflows. And there was a lot of discussion about keeping these up to date and how we do that, and that having an editable sort of training like documentation that people can add to or say, hey, I found an issue with it, I would want to update it in this way, would be really beneficial so that things are up to date. And then we also talked about them being modular and trustworthy, and that the trustworthiness is really important for people to feel like they're finding a resource, and then if it's modular, you can kind of like work through a resource as opposed to having lots of scattered resources. Some challenges and things that we thought could be done better are that, well, one main challenge was that data and compute proximity is really important, and that also ease of discovery of both of those things is really important. We also wanted to think about training material that targets various levels of users. We appreciated some examples such as Free Code Camp and Khan Academy, and that we also talked about wanting to include future data curators and thinking about how we can train people to add information to a data commons successfully. One other challenge that we talked about was just funding for storing data and for accessing compute resources. And we wanted to highlight a freemium access model that both identifies deserving users and uses some sort of like sliding scale feature. And we wanted to think about this being like use dependent, so that if somebody's a really heavy user, maybe they pay more for a resource, but that if somebody wants to try something out in an educational circumstance, that they can kind of have access to try a smaller instance out. So we also talked about keeping curricula up to date as a major challenge, and that we really need to have a sort of cultural change in sharing resources within the teaching community. And then as far as community building and outreach goes, we highlighted reaching out to middle and high schools as something that maybe is a gap. But there's one example, Code to College, that somebody brought up that has been working really well as a sort of pipeline to get people involved in this sort of work. And then as far as university outreach goes, we have a couple of examples listed here that are successful examples. And then we also really wanted to be sure to consider some additional people, such as those who are changing careers and may really appreciate boot camps or things like Project Pythia that are a modular resource. We also talked about involving campus ambassadors, career advisors, cooperative science centers, middle schools, and using that as a pipeline, job fairs, and then also really emphasizing boots on the ground sorts of efforts.
All right, thank you, Tegan. Library C.
And I think when we're talking about barriers with clouds and HPC, it's really three different levels. One is the conceptual level, and what do we mean by cloud and cloud computing? And really, there should be a separation between both storage and the computing, right? Oftentimes, you need a lot of times users don't need to know a lot of things that's happening, where it's happening. Just like you don't need to know the EC2 instance and to stream a movie from Netflix, because that's what they does. And users don't need to know a lot of things, but there are certain users may need to, especially in the operational use and those large scale analysis, they might need to know those computing and other different services that how they can use it. And the other aspects of it is the capacity and skills for the people who are using it, and especially for those underrepresented users in the current ecosystems. Then how can we provide the examples to bring them to the future landscape that Data Commons will provide, and also the interfaces? How can we make those technologies easy for the users to use and adapt? And there's also some discussion between what's the difference between data commons versus science gateways, and then how those two things may be at different layers but can work together on supporting different users. And then last piece is that really actually the cost and the funding models, funding structures, and how can groups band together to negotiate with especially when you go to the commercial and public clouds, to negotiate the funding or the cost models to make it sustainable and feasible and more realistic. Just an example is that University of California system have been negotiating together with those publishers and how they can have those open access publishing for their researchers, and they decided to discontinue with elsewhere subscriptions, just like we're not supporting anything related to elsewhere for those like for the scientists they are publishing in that case.
Library B.
All right, so our discussion was about expanding accessibility and standardizing of processes, but under limited funding. So I think one of the key topics that we pulled out of here was the idea that like a small initial investment upfront in documentation, examples, it's added time at the beginning, but that kind of snowballs, and those examples and everything actually end up saving time in the long run, instead of getting a bunch of emails over the course of a couple of years about something. If you just spend a little extra time to provide some code snippets or potentially links to other publications and other examples, you're actually ending up saving a lot of time, which I think it's hard to see when you're living in the moment. We talked a lot about community involvement, crowdsourcing different things, incentivizing contributions, basically just making sure that the work that you do is visible to other people that might come and look at things. We had a good talk as well about the difference between education versus training. A lot of people are very smart and they have good education about how to do what they need to do, but they're not trained well on how to actually present that in the appropriate way sometimes. So a lot of that talk was culture around data citations and community agreements. You might agree to do something when you go to visit a website, but that doesn't actually carry over in the long run. Either you don't have the time, you forgot about it. So that kind of circles into building these code of conducts and standardizing those user agreements and trying to facilitate making that easier. I think part of our discussion was even when that is very easy, people still don't do it. So I think a decent way, and we talked as a group that potentially leading by example is a good way to lift the others like around us up to that standard. We had a good discussion too when it came to accessibility about continuity and consistency just across the board, right? As you're navigating these different landscapes, if you have to change contexts and these types of things, those become barriers that will drive people away. So by building consistency and kind of continuity, that really encourages people to use the tools and continue to use them. And then lastly too, I think the problems always will scale to the budget. And we talked about that as a group, right? More money just comes with more problems sometimes as well. So it is. Yeah, that's some lyrics right there. But so yeah, that's pretty much all we came up with.
Let's hear the song. Yeah, good job. Thank you. All right, library.
All right, so our topic was policies, specifically focused on data accession and deaccession in repositories. So of all the data that we're talking about here at this meeting, what of those do we keep and preserve? Why? How long? And which ones would we get rid of? And in what cases would we do that? So a number of facets of that we talked about. We had some examples from folks in the discussion that practices currently at repositories, and the maturity of policies around this vary quite a bit. And so it might be worth doing a survey of what those policies are in this sector to see if there's any commonalities. I think the NOAA data centers have a very structured policy framework, and others less so in terms of deaccessioning in particular. Storage alone is not sufficient to ensure usability, right? So policies should address more than just how long we keep things, or if we're keeping it sort of yes or no, right? There's questions about how to keep things useful over time that are equally important here to avoid bit rot, formats that might go out of date. So even if you have the data around, they're not usable if you haven't been doing something to them along the way. Archives like NCAR NOAA are valuable partners for smaller repositories who may have more challenges around resources, and knowledge and resources for long-term archiving. And as I mentioned, NOAA in particular has current retention policies that are more structured probably than others. We talked about a variety of criteria for retention, which are listed here. So duplication of data, if these data exist everywhere, maybe a given repository doesn't need to keep a copy of them. The flip side of that is uniqueness. If they are unique, especially observations, those are obviously of high value and importance for preservation. Past use, so how often are data being used? Level of interest. Can data be reproduced? So we talked about model outputs a fair amount in this context. And there's lots of considerations for that. Timeline of utility. It's not possible always to predict which data will be used down the road. So a couple years after the paper comes out might be initial framework, but there might be other reasons to keep things longer. Can you keep data around long enough to create smaller derived products? So maybe you have 100 terabytes at the beginning, but after 5 years you find ways to reduce the size via various mechanisms to 20 terabytes or something that reduces your storage costs. Uniqueness, as I mentioned. Some data sets get used as reference points for a lot of other work. Sometimes that's done on purpose. There's composite data sets used as standard sea surface temperature reference points or something. But sometimes you can't always predict which data sets are going to have that role. And there was a comment that we might consider looking at this in sort of a risk analysis framework. What is the risk if something is lost or deaccessioned? Risk to the community for not having that around. We discussed publication requirements and the needs to have DOIs for data. Does that drive increased storage expectations? So we're kind of saving things just because we're told to, not necessarily because they have value. It's a question there. Will new techniques like machine learning analysis platforms, taking analysis to the data that we've been discussing here, will those create new types of data, model data, different types of process-derived products? How will they fit into the accession and deaccession frameworks? And then we also talked about this system-to-system access. So again, this duplication question. If currently there's a lot of duplication in storage because I need to download this data set, and my colleagues down the road at the university need to download this data set. if there was easier ways to figure out who has already downloaded these things, we could potentially duplicate storage, still enable value and have access to data, but reduce duplication of redundant storage. That's it.
All right, round of applause to all of you. I'm just going to highlight this general notes document. So that's one mechanism that we have available, to contribute your thoughts and continue to contribute once the workshop's done. I tried to come up with some bullet points for high-level takeaways that I thought about on my drive up here this morning. So please review that, add to that, comment on it, and then if you have topics such as future collaborations, other topics like that, please put them in here, and this will be kind of an evolving living document, I think. But what I'm going for here is some high-level concepts that could be used to inform a workshop report, since we have to write one. Anyway, let me see here. So we're near the top of the hour, so I'm not going to take too much time here. But I just, I'll put on slideshow. There we go. I just kind of wanted to, we started with this figure, and I want to kind of go back to this figure. And I think we really covered a number of these different hexagons in the figure through this workshop. So we'll have to try to, this could be something we could build a report around as well, for the report writers, and kind of coalesce things into these different categories. So I think that's something we'll look at, and thanks to everybody for your contributions. I think out of that crowdsourced breakout session, there are a lot of ideas and topics for follow-on discussions or possible workshops. So I encourage people to look at those opportunities. And then in terms of plan next steps, the organizers of the workshop are going to work to synthesize the notes, summarize recurring themes, draft a report. I'll provide it initially to the steering committee for feedback, revise the report. Then we'll provide it to the full participant audience for feedback and comments. Likely we'll finalize and publish this as what's called an NCAR technical note. That has to be done within 3 months, so that's the timeline for this output. And then possibly is there an opportunity to publish something in a peer-reviewed journal to give it a bit more exposure. One idea that we have that, we'll see how this evolves, but is possibly seeking stakeholders. We have a project at NCAR that we're looking at developing a data commons. This is one component of this, and I want to kind of emphasize that the workshop report is supposed to be general enough for us to cite and look at, but for others in the community to use and build upon to develop some of their own solutions and capabilities. So it's not going to be NCAR specific. It's going to be used to inform what we do, but I want it to be reusable, as we are going for with a number of concepts, to inform others, hopefully. So that's kind of the goal of the report out. But then the follow-up might be these common stakeholder focus groups. So if you're interested, let me know. Are there categories that we didn't capture? We might reach out to some of you to see if you're interested in participating in any of these things. But these groups would kind of provide requirements for what we're doing internally. So that's kind of the internal side of things at NCAR. Other ideas? We're kind of at the top of the hour, so unfortunately we don't have a lot of time for discussion now because people might have to leave to get back to where they're going. We're at 11:06, but please put them into the general notes document, and we'll take note of that. And I'll mention for a communication mechanism, there's that iOS email list. Anybody, as long as you follow the code of conduct, can post to that. So that's another avenue to communicate with one another. And if you have thoughts on additional avenues where we can collaborate together moving forward. So with that, thanks for your participation, openness to one another's ideas, willingness to make yourselves vulnerable in some cases, to express those ideas, and your enthusiasm. So let's give yourselves a round of applause. And then Tasia, I want to thank you a lot for all of your organization, and Kristen. So. And then the gentleman up in the booth, thank you so much for being nimble and dealing with all my last minute requests.
Hello, yes, just some logistic things. Okay, just checking. One, I have a basket out here. If you don't want your badge, I will try to recycle it. So just pop it in that basket on the table. And then two, if we planned your travel, please don't forget to send us your receipts and we'll expense them as soon as possible. I think that's all I have. So thank you. It was nice to meet you all. Oh, and the bus is going back to the hotel at 11:30. I'm not sure how helpful that is for all of you, but it will be going back at 11:30. So, thank you.